Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, July 17th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Takeaways from Trump's address claiming election vulnerabilities. Documents released by the Trump administration to support the president's claims did not back up his most aggressive statements. By Julian E. Barnes and Maggie Haberman. President Trump said his address on Thursday night was about the public building confidence in American elections, but he spent much of his speech undermining them. A broken election system is one of Mr. Trump's most common refrains, dating to early 2016. Great damage has been done to our country, the president said. Our elections were left vulnerable to being rigged and stolen, and the trust of the American people was lost. This cannot be allowed to continue. But documents Mr. Trump released to support his claims and previous assessments from the intelligence community do not back up his most aggressive statements about election security. In fact, some of the documents reach the opposite conclusion. They also do not contain significant new revelations about vulnerabilities in the election system. One of the documents posted on the White House website was blunt. We assess that vote tabulation systems would be difficult to manipulate on a wide enough scale to compromise election results. Below are takeaways from Mr. Trump's primetime speech. Trump called for bolstering protections he has dismantled. Mr. Trump called for fixing vulnerabilities in electronic voting systems so that we can never watch a stolen election again. If you look at voting today, it's in such bad shape in so many states, Mr. Trump said, and we are committing to fix it. And we are also committing to be working with those states and local jurisdictions to help them fix and patch known technical vulnerabilities before the midterm elections. But Mr. Trump has spent the first part of his second term dismantling the election protections built up over previous years. The FBI's task force on foreign influence was shut down. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence sharply cut back a task force that warned against foreign meddling, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has been gutted. And Mr. Trump has appointed an heir to a housing fortune with no relevant experience as the interim Director of National Intelligence. Grains of truth were blown out of proportion. Mr. Trump described a series of allegations about voter interference in the 2020 vote. He said that China had bought, stolen, or hacked tens of millions of voter data files across 18 states, and he attacked a deep state conspiracy that he said was aimed at suppressing the information. Yet those responsible for sounding the alarm instead kept the information secret and hidden, Mr. Trump said. They did not disclose to me as president or to anyone else, and to the best of our knowledge, they did not inform Congress. It is true that the documents show an intense debate among intelligence officials about alerting their superiors. But U.S. intelligence and congressional officials have long known that China obtained voter data, publicly available information often purchased by political campaigns. What's more, former intelligence officials have said China gathered the data not to manipulate voting results, but instead to better craft influence campaigns to shape voters' perceptions. While the documents outline some nascent interest by Chinese officials in influence operations, they concede Beijing never endorsed any broad-based effort to undercut Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump also referred to a report about Venezuela showing it could successfully tamper with voting machines. John Solomon, who is leading Mr. Trump's task force on declassifying documents on a range of issues, told reporters outside the White House that the intelligence community documents show no evidence that votes in election machines were changed in the past 3 elections. What about Russia? Railing against the FBI and intelligence agencies' investigations into Russian meddling in 2016 is one of Mr. Trump's favorite themes. And in 2020, a majority of intelligence officials assessed that the Russian campaign to denigrate Joseph R. Biden Jr. was the most robust. At the time, John Ratcliffe, then the Director of National Intelligence, disagreed with that view and argued that career intelligence officials had downplayed China's efforts. But Mr. Trump barely mentioned Russia in his speech on Thursday, using most of it to lament Chinese efforts to denigrate him. Mr. Trump's approach to Russia has long been to treat its president, Vladimir V. Putin, as a peer, and his Justice Department is currently pressing ahead with an investigation into a possible grand conspiracy by Democrats to tie the president to Russia. Mr. Trump appeared to allude to such a conspiracy with a non sequitur about burn bags, which are used to get rid of government documents that no longer need to be saved, and former President Barack Obama. He repeated a demand for voting restrictions before the midterms. For weeks, Mr. Trump has been pressuring Congress to pass a broad election bill to curb mail-in voting, provide documentary proof of citizenship, and show photo identification to vote. Mr. Trump ended his speech with a call to Congress to pass it, despite Republican resistance. Addressing this crisis of election security demands that Congress must pass the Save America Act, Mr. Trump said. The only reason you would not do it is you want to cheat, because your policies are so bad and your candidates are so pathetic. But the problems Mr. Trump focused on in his speech, allegations that foreign governments are mounting influence campaigns or could potentially hack local election authorities, have almost nothing to do with the measures that are part of the bill. And the lack of focus on anything else forward-looking underscores how little Mr. Trump's interest in elections is about the ones still to come compared to the ones he has already faced. Wildfire smoke from Canada turns the air hazardous for millions. The haze is likely to ease in the east this weekend, but linger in the upper Midwest, where some cities recorded extremely high pollution indexes on Thursday. By Judson Jones, Nicholas Bogle-Burrows, and Michael Levison. Urban skylines vanished in an eye-watering haze. Parks and ball fields that normally fill with dog walkers and joggers were eerily quiet. Some beaches and pools closed. Cars slowed down as visibility dwindled in the gloomy light of a dull orange sun. A blanket of dense smoke from Canadian wildfires stretched across Ontario into the Midwestern and Northeastern United States on Thursday, disrupting life for millions and prompting many to stay inside with the windows shut. Others tried to limit the amount of time they spent outside, as air quality readings surged to dangerous levels in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Minneapolis, Toronto, and many places in between. The air in northeastern cities like Washington, Philadelphia, and New York rated only slightly better, but was still unhealthy and gray with the acrid scent of a campfire. In Chicago, Brandon Olson, a 35-year-old digital advertising worker, took his dog, Junie, for a short stroll in Portage Park on Thursday morning, but said he planned to skip their evening walk. "I walked outside and could feel it in my eyes," he said. "I was not expecting that. It has a metallic taste and probably isn't too good of an idea to be out here long." In New York City, Robert Vargas felt unsettled as he took his 9-year-old son Aiden to Soundview Park in the Bronx on Thursday afternoon. "I'm worried it could mess up his lungs," Mr. Vargas, 47, a retail store manager, said as his son kicked along on a scooter. Firefighters on September 11th inhaled all that smoke and they started getting sick down the line. The bad air was the product of about 800 wildfires burning across Canada, particularly the roughly 180 that have been burning in Ontario, where the fires have prompted air quality warnings, road closures, and some evacuations. More than 150 crews and nearly 50 firefighting aircraft were working around the clock to extinguish the fires, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, said on Thursday. The smoke spread widely into the United States this week as the same high-pressure system, known as a heat dome, which led to brutal heat in the Midwest and the Northeast, trapped the smoke and pushed it close to the ground. By the weekend, as another weather system pushes the hottest air away, the heat and the smoke are expected to ease in the Northeast, allowing for cleaner air during the World Cup final in New Jersey on Sunday. But in the upper Midwest, closer to the fires, the smoke and the heat are likely to linger through the weekend. Summer wildfire smoke, common in parts of the western United States, may become part of the new normal in the Northeast and Midwest, As climate change drives global temperatures past record levels, it is making severe fire weather more common, drying out plants and soil and raising the chances of longer, more severe forest fire seasons, researchers have found. A similar cloud of smoke from Canadian wildfires hung over New York City in June 2023, delaying flights and prompting the cancellation of 3 big theater productions and 2 Major League Baseball games. On Thursday, the Air Quality Index, which measures the density of 5 pollutants, ground-level ozone, particulates, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, reached eye-popping levels in the upper Midwest. An AQI of 50 or below represents good air quality. Anything over 150 is considered unhealthy, and over 300 is hazardous. In the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the AQI hit 785. In Toledo, Ohio, it was 775. In Milwaukee, where the AQI was 460, Dave Sell drove to Bradford Beach on Lake Michigan with his dog Yo-Yo. The beach was mostly empty, with only about 15 people there, rather than the thousands who normally crowd it on a typical July day. The lake was clouded in a suffocating haze. "You can't even see the blue water," Mr. Sell said. "It looks dingy and gray and brown, and its smell is gross." Wildfire smoke can exacerbate the symptoms of respiratory conditions like asthma. People with other chronic conditions like diabetes and heart disease also have a higher risk of getting sick, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Children and pregnant women may also be at risk, according to the agency. But anyone can feel the effects of wildfire smoke. Inhaling it can immediately cause coughing and wheezing, a headache, stinging eyes, a scratchy throat, sinus irritation, chest pain, a rapid heartbeat, and fatigue. Officials in many cities and states urged people to stay inside if possible. Governor Kathy Hochul of New York said it would provide more than 100,000 masks, some of which would be distributed at transit hubs, including Penn Station and Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan. New York City, where the AQI topped 150, made free masks available at some public libraries, which have also served as cooling centers this week. Chicago closed its beaches and outdoor pools on Thursday, and a Major League Soccer game at Soldier Field was rescheduled for October. An outdoor concert by the rock band Creed near Minneapolis was rescheduled for September. Lakewood, Ohio, on Lake Erie, closed public pools, citing the unhealthy air quality. "It's terrible out here today, and I can tell it's a little harder to breathe," said Terry P., 71, who took a morning swim in Lakewood before the pools closed. "But I had a little fun with it. The lifeguards take music requests for us when we do our morning swim, and I asked for smoke on the water." The United States and Canada have had a tense relationship since the start of President Trump's trade wars, and 4 Republican House members from Michigan sent a letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada this week accusing the country of mismanaging the wildfires. "Michiganders shouldn't have to breathe Canada's negligence," one of them, Lisa McLean, said in a statement. Senator Bernie Moreno, Republican of Ohio, said he would introduce a bill next week to penalize Canada for this atrocity. Mr. Carney, asked at a news conference in Ontario to respond to the criticism, said, "There must be a contribution from the United States in the fight against climate change." For others, the smoke was a reminder that American cities, for all their creature comforts, are not immune to the dangerously poor air quality that has become an inescapable part of life in other parts of the world. As Raj Advani, 44, a software engineer who was walking his dog in New York City, put it, "This is how it is in Delhi every day." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. 2 dead and scores rescued as flooding engulfs central Texas. Flooding from relentless rain, which Governor Greg Abbott said was likely to break records, left a trail of damage in many communities in the Hill Country region. By J.C. Fortin, Pooja Salhotra, Edgar Sandoval, Saley Aranda, and Judson Jones. As the Guadalupe River rose to treacherous levels in Comfort, Texas, on Thursday morning, emergency workers knocked on the door of Jody Koopman's recreational vehicle, not far from the muddy, rushing waters, and told her it was time to go. Ms. Koopman, 53, a retired librarian, found shelter at a nearby high school with her husband, sister, 2 children, and 4 pets. She said that it had been difficult to leave her camper and most of her possessions behind and at the mercy of the bloated river and the relentless rain. "I knew that it would rain," Ms. Koopman said, acknowledging the deadly deluge in the area 1 year ago, "but last year was supposed to be the 100-year flood. This is unexpected." Torrential rains have submerged much of central Texas in floodwater, killing at least 2 people, forcing scores of others to evacuate their homes, some by helicopter, and leaving a trail of damage along the Guadalupe. By Thursday evening, conditions showed no sign of abating. Uvalde, Johnson City, and Comfort may experience peak flows among the 5 most severe on record as water thrashes from the Frio, Pedernales, and Guadalupe rivers, Governor Greg Abbott said at a news conference on Thursday evening. Currently expected at the Nueces River near Uvalde is 2 times the flow of Niagara Falls, he said, adding that a record could be set into Friday. City and county officials all across the Texas Hill Country, particularly areas west and northwest of San Antonio, have issued flash flood warnings and evacuation notices, saying the conditions are life-threatening. 1 man died near Comfort after he was swept away in an RV. A second man died near Uvalde while driving, the police said. The man, 74, was found dead in his vehicle in floodwaters north of the city, according to the Uvalde Police Department. Search teams have completed at least 230 rescues, the governor said. More than 2,000 state emergency responders have been deployed, he added. More than 1,400 vehicles, including rescue boats and Black Hawk helicopters. Mr. Abbott has urged people to stay off the roads. In Comfort, the river's height had earlier reached up to 37 feet, according to the National Weather Service, rising more than 25 feet in an hour. In photos and videos on social media, residents across central Texas captured jarring scenes. Deer bobbing their heads just above the rushing waters of Cibolo Creek, metal debris floating down a road in Ingram, and storefronts in small towns full of hopelessly damaged and waterlogged wares. Many Texans who were affected were still reeling from last summer's floods. "We're unsure of what to do at this point," said Haley Caswell, the general manager of Buck Wild Animal Rescue in Ingram, where she said her coops, pens, and supplies had suffered serious damage, just as they did last year. "We did make a lot of progress," she said, of the recovery of her business since last summer, but this is more than a setback. The Weather Service issued a rare high-risk forecast for excessive rain in parts of central Texas on Thursday morning. It issues that level of alert only rarely, although it is not the first time it has done so this week. Over the past decade, some of the deadliest and most destructive floods have occurred in areas that forecasters said were at this level of risk. Much of the rain has eased temporarily by late Thursday, but scattered storms were still moving across the region, threatening more flash flooding on saturated ground. Storms continued into Friday with flash flood warnings for parts of south-central Texas, but the rain is expected to lighten and drier conditions should arrive by early next week. That could bring some relief to a thoroughly soaked landscape. In some parts of Texas, rainfall totals since Monday have reached almost 2 feet. In Carville, the Carr County seat, residents were advised to shelter in place on Thursday. Barbara Walker, 56, who owns a flower shop there but lives 20 miles away, woke up early to the sound of pounding rain. Then came a text message with bad news. A tenant of the apartment above Ms. Walker's shop, who was evacuated before dawn, shared some alarming photos. "My shop is underwater," Ms. Walker said. "Last year's floods did not do nearly as much damage," she added. "This is something that has never, ever happened before." A judge in Carr County signed a disaster declaration on Thursday, citing extensive damage to roads, sewers, homes, and schools. "I have determined that this incident is of such severity and magnitude that an effective response is beyond the capability of Carr County to control," Rob Kelly, the Carr County judge, wrote in the declaration. Heavy rain and flash flooding are not uncommon in Texas in mid-July, but this week's rain brought painful memories of the catastrophic flood about a year ago in central Texas that killed 139 people, including 25 campers from Camp Mystic, a girls' camp on the Guadalupe River. Flash floods are now threatening the same area. Joe Herring Jr., the mayor of Carville, said that lives had been saved this week by improved flood warning systems. Since last year's tragedy, sirens have been installed along the Guadalupe River, and many residents took the evacuation warning seriously. This community has grit, Mr. Herring said, not once but twice. The Hill Country is part of an area known as Flash Flood Alley that is particularly susceptible to dangerous flooding because of its steep terrain and shallow soil that does not soak up much water. In and around Uvalde, about 80 miles west of San Antonio, and one of the cities most affected by flooding, officials closed major highways and many city streets and ordered residents to shelter in place unless they were in immediate danger. Businesses along much of Main Street were closed as the water crept higher and higher overnight into Thursday. Gat Mitchell, who owns a honey business in Uvalde, said that the rising floodwaters had soaked important paperwork, like invoices, and washed away thousands of dollars worth of inventory. Jars spilled out, he said. Glass broke. The flooding has not been so bad in San Antonio, where he lives, he said. But the rain was adding up there too, and the roads were a mess. There was just wreck on wreck on wreck, he said. Residents there on Thursday were still making sense of the destruction left behind by a tornado the day before. It ripped through the Rim, a commercial center on the north side of the city, uprooting trees, battering the facade of a Marshall's store, and tossing air conditioners into buildings. Sally Palacios, a waitress at a nearby IHOP, said that she sensed something wrong on Wednesday morning when the skies suddenly darkened and the doors began to tremble. I felt scared, she said. Tornadoes are not something you see every day. The IHOP avoided the worst of the damage, said Adeline De Leon, a manager there, but other businesses weren't so lucky. It looked like a movie, she said. I've never seen anything like it. Americans are spending, and not just on necessities. Lower gas prices have been a relief for households struggling with higher living costs, but now they are creeping higher again. By Talman Joseph Smith and Ben Castleman. When food prices began rising rapidly at the end of last year, American households spent more on groceries. When gas prices spiked this spring, they spent more on fuel. After all, what choice did they have? But with inflation cooling, at least for now, and the moribund labor market showing some newfound life, there are hints that more Americans are taking the opportunity to spend more on what they want, not just what they have to buy. Retail sales data from the Census Bureau on Thursday provided the latest evidence. U.S. retail and food service sales were up by a solid 0.2% in June, a slight deceleration from April and May numbers, but it builds upon a steadying trend. Spending in discretionary categories like furniture stores, electronics retailers, and restaurants all rose. For the second quarter as a whole, sales were up 6.4% from a year earlier, before adjusting for inflation. For wealthy Americans, spending freed up cash on hand is nothing new. Buoyed by surging stock portfolios, the rich have been shelling out for first-class plane tickets, fancy meals at restaurants, and other luxuries. The highest-earning top third has helped keep overall consumption robust, despite high interest rates, tariffs, and other economic headwinds. Many other households, however, have been struggling just to maintain their standard of living amid rising prices and slowing wage growth. Debt levels have soared in recent years, and saving rates have tumbled. The challenge became even more acute when gas prices jumped this spring, leading inflation to outpace wage growth. Now, though, there are tentative signs that discretionary spending may be rising among lower and moderate income households as well. The government doesn't break down spending by income level on a monthly basis, but data from private sources points to early evidence of a turnaround. Credit card data from Bank of America shows that spending in recent weeks has risen faster for lower-income households than for higher earners. And they were spending more not just on essentials, but also on discretionary items like restaurant meals and travel. What was really notable was how broad it was, said Liz Everett Chrisberg, the head of the Bank of America Institute. It wasn't just one group, it was all of the income groups. It wasn't just one category, it was retail and services. It was discretionary and necessity spending. The respite for consumers may prove short-lived if the U.S. conflict with Iran deteriorates further. That is already showing up at the pump, with gas prices creeping back up to $3.94 per gallon on average, according to the AAA Motor Club. Economists warn that if oil prices return to their previous highs, then they will once again filter through the cost of food and other goods. But after facing 5 years of elevated inflation, consumers have become more adept at navigating prices. Even as they are forced to pay more for essentials like rent, food, and gas, many families have found ways to make room for elective or discretionary purchases as well, said Michelle Meyer, chief economist of the MasterCard Economics Institute. Even within that basket of necessities, consumers have made shifts so that they can still make room for discretionary spending, she said. You buy more in bulk, you go to restaurants less. Consumers are trying to demand the best value that they can. Retail analysts make sense of how much spending is driven by voluntary optional purchases and how much is consumption of essentials by splitting data into discretionary and non-discretionary purchases, but it can be a tricky business. Rent or mortgage payments, groceries, utilities like electricity and water, insurance, car payments, and taxes are clearly musts. But other categories like clothes and car purchases are closer calls, said Brian Williams, the chief economist at the Groundwork Collaborative, a consumer watchdog group. Priscilla Thyagamurthy, a senior economist at BMO Capital Markets, a financial firm, estimates that about 35% to 45% of retail sales are discretionary, with the remainder tied more closely to necessities. She added that in recent numbers, the strength in the discretionary categories means households are doing more than simply paying higher prices for necessities. It points to underlying consumer demand remaining reasonably healthy. A hot labor market, in which jobs are plentiful and wages are rising, has historically been the best way for average workers to consistently get ahead. When the job market faltered last year, economists warned that households may have little choice but to pull back. More recently, though, the labor market has shown signs of renewed strength. Job growth has picked up this year. Wage growth for people who change jobs has accelerated in recent months. So has hourly pay for restaurant and hotel workers, whose earnings lagged when the labor market softened last year. A few weeks of faster wage growth and lower gas prices in the first half of this year are hardly going to offset years of rising living costs in either consumers' attitudes or their finances. Many of the divides between the wealthy and households of humbler means are long-standing. Thrifty consumers can shift their spending only if they have income to spend. The same research team at Bank of America that has tracked the new green shoots in credit card spending among lower-income households also notes that they are the group with the least wiggle room in their budgets. Even when there is an upswing in the purchasing power of households within the bottom half, it tends to come from a low baseline of savings. Recent data from the Federal Reserve shows that the bottom 40% of earners in the United States had little to no discretionary income, and that this has been a steady trend virtually unchanged since the mid-1980s. Other research estimates from the Fed indicate that with the exception of 2020 and 2021, the years associated with emergency aid during the COVID-19 pandemic, roughly half of households had no discretionary income. In the 5 years before the pandemic, a period characterized by a strong job market and little inflation, hourly earnings rose about 15% for the average worker, while grocery prices were more or less flat. In the 5 years from 2021 to 2026, wages were up even more, 25%, but grocery prices were up about 25% too. Perhaps the starkest divide in the economy is between renters and homeowners. Rents, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, have risen by roughly a third on average since before the pandemic, and have risen even faster in some cities. Homeowners have seen their insurance and utility bills rise, but their mortgage costs are typically fixed, and many were able to lock in low borrowing costs during the low interest rate era of the recent past. Wealthy households, who mostly own their own homes, have also benefited from a record run in the stock market. Data published by Brian LeBlanc at PNC Bank shows households have been cashing out their enormous stock market gains over the past couple years and using the earnings as disposable income, affluent baby boomers in particular. And data from MasterCard shows that consumers in higher income zip codes are expanding discretionary and recreational purchases. The bottom 50% of households by net worth own only 1% of the U.S. stock market, however, meaning they don't have access to those sort of capital gains. The gusher of spending from the well-to-do is also partly driving up inflation. Airfares are up 27% over the past year. Airlines like Delta passed along higher jet fuel costs to their consumers this spring. But Delta's chief executive has explained he expects airfares will stay elevated through summer as a result of robust demand from its consumer base. Sales from premium seats have outpaced those in coach. Upper-income households are spending with basically no sensitivity to price, said Robert Socken, the chief U.S. economist at PGIM, the asset management firm, and they spend more on discretionary items than lower-income cohorts. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Ukraine's ousted defense minister attacks the military's old guard. Mikhailo Fedorov defended his efforts to modernize the Ukrainian armed forces as thousands of people protested his dismissal. By Cassandra Vinograd, Andrew E. Kramer, and Alexander Chobko. Ukraine's ousted defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, issued a fervent defense on Thursday of his efforts to modernize the Ukrainian military and directly attacked the country's top general as thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets to protest Mr. Fedorov's dismissal. At a news conference in Kyiv, the capital, Mr. Fedorov said that he had urged President Volodymyr Zelensky to remove his primary antagonist in the military hierarchy, Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief, but the president declined. Mr. Fedorov, who clashed repeatedly with Mr. Syrsky while championing a high-tech vision of warfare dominated by drones, accused the commander-in-chief of blocking all of our initiatives. Instead of figuring out how to defeat Russia asymmetrically, Mr. Fedorov, 35, said, referring to the drone campaign, Mr. Syrsky figured out how to split the country. In a social media post, Mr. Syrsky, 60, did not directly address Mr. Fedorov's accusations, but said that the former defense minister's news conference had been possible only because of the military's successes in defending Ukraine. We need to focus on the war and on an effective strategy that is currently demonstrating concrete results, Mr. Syrsky wrote, thanking Mr. Fedorov for his service. Mr. Zelensky acknowledged the rift that had led to the shakeup and the protests, saying he would have preferred unity. In such circumstances, you have to choose one side or the other, he said at a news conference alongside Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain, who is visiting Kyiv. Ukrainians rallied in cities across the country to demand a reversal of Mr. Fedorov's dismissal just 6 months into his tenure. The protesters were dismayed that Mr. Zelensky had ousted his defense minister, just as many military analysts said the war had turned in Ukraine's favor. The shift is more marked than any since the conflict's first months, when Russia endured a series of defeats. The demonstrations were only the second large street protests in Ukraine during more than 4 years of war. Rallies also took place last year against a move by Mr. Zelensky to neuter anti-corruption agencies. On Thursday, protesters poured into a square in central Kyiv. They turned out in Odessa in the south and Lviv in the west. In the frontline city of Kharkiv in the northeast, more than 300 protesters with cardboard signs crowded sidewalks, chanting "Shame, shame, shame." Their numbers grew as the morning wore on. "Hands off Fedorov," one sign read. "Why break what's working?" read another. Mr. Fedorov is a prominent proponent of the use of unmanned systems in the war. He had come to symbolize Ukraine's success in using long-range drones to strike military and oil industry targets inside Russia and to wage an intense campaign to cut off occupied Crimea. Many protesters expressed despair over his removal, seeing it as a victory for an old guard inside the military that had disagreed with Mr. Fedorov's vision for the future of war. Variations of Fedorov is innovation, old grandpas are degeneration, appeared on many of the cardboard signs. Mr. Fedorov had also angered well-connected defense contractors with programs threatening their businesses, such as one that allowed soldiers to buy their own weapons on a military website. In his remarks on Thursday, Mr. Fedorov acknowledged the anger on the streets. "Today, we see that the Ukrainian people have taken a stand," he said, adding, "Why is it that now, when hopes have emerged and the initiative has been seized, this trajectory is breaking?" At the protest in Kharkiv, Maria Shapelina, 12, stood quietly with her grandfather holding a sign that read, "Bring back Fedorov." It was her first time protesting, Maria said. Most of her friends were home, she added, but she felt it was important to come out and make her feelings known. "Winning the war is the most important thing," she said, and Mr. Fedorov had been doing great work. "Our president wants to overthrow him because he's doing a good job," she said. "People don't like it, and neither do I. We want the president to hear us," she added, as her grandfather looked down, proud of her English and her civic sensibility. "We need to speak." The call for Thursday's street protests came from Dmytro Kozyatinsky, a war veteran who in July orchestrated the demonstrations against Mr. Zelensky's crackdown on anti-corruption agencies. Those demonstrations, known as the cardboard protests for their hastily drawn signs, ultimately led Mr. Zelensky to reverse course. On Thursday, at least 1,000 people gathered in the square in central Kyiv, at a spot within earshot of Mr. Zelensky's office on Bankova Street. The crowd of mostly young people stamped their feet, waving signs and demanding the resignation of Mr. Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief. "I really worry about what is happening now," said Andrei Fedon, 54, a retired psychologist. He said he previously supported Mr. Zelensky, admiring the president's diplomacy and rallying the world to Ukraine's side, but believed that firing a popular defense minister just as the war turned in Ukraine's favor was a mistake. "The Russians dream of our having internal problems," he said. "Why remove him now?" As images of demonstrations ricocheted across social media, Mr. Zelensky called them a sign of a healthy system. "We are fighting for freedom and democracy, so it seems to me that we are doing everything right," he said during his news conference with Mr. Starmer, "since we can ensure that even during wartime, with all the difficulties and restrictions, people are able to express their will." At least one senior military official said he was resigning in protest of Mr. Fedorov's dismissal. Colonel Pavlov Yelizarov, the deputy commander of Ukraine's air forces. "This is a great evil for the country's defense capability," he wrote in a Facebook post alongside a resignation letter, warning that abandoning Mr. Fedorov's strategic air defense reforms would lead to more damage from Russian strikes. Many other Ukrainians shared their dismay on social media, including Deep State, a Ukrainian organization with ties to the military that tracks battlefield movements. "Dismiss Syrskyi," Deep State wrote in a post on Telegram, where it has more than 765,000 followers. In Kharkiv, Katerina Arkhipova, a protester who works at an IT company, said that Ukraine could win the war only by having a young, reformed system with new approaches, rather than with outdated Soviet approaches to life, war, and regulations. Some serving soldiers joined the demonstrations. Nazary Yeremenkov, 25, protested what he called a glaring injustice, saying he hoped that the power of the people, the power of free speech, will bring more sanity to the legislative system of Ukraine. He pointed to Ukraine's deep strikes into Russia, its campaign to cut off Crimea, and its attacks on Moscow to ramp up pressure on President Vladimir V. Putin as proof of Fedorov's value. "Me and my brothers in arms, we see an increase in efficiency," he said. The crowd behind him chanted, "Parliament, say no," urging lawmakers to reject Mr. Zelensky's choice to replace Fedorov, reported to be the Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko. Mr. Fedorov's departure comes during a broader government reshuffling that has included the resignation of Prime Minister Yulia Sverdlenko. Mr. Zelensky replaced her with Serhiy Koretsky, the chief executive of the National Oil and Gas Company. While Parliament voted to approve the nomination of Mr. Koretsky and other ministers, the vote for defense minister was delayed, a possible sign that Mr. Zelensky could face trouble in gaining approval for his choice. In his remarks at the news conference, Mr. Zelensky said he was still considering whom to nominate. Hours later, he said he had asked General Yevhen Khamara, the head of Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency, to serve as acting defense minister. Like Mr. Fedorov, General Khamara had been in his role at the agency for only about 6 months. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Israeli government pushes through divisive laws before election. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu backed a series of laws undermining legal oversight of the government, benefiting allied media outlets and aiming to shore up ultra-Orthodox political support. By Isabel Kirshner and Jonathan Rice. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government used the final days of Parliament before Israel's fall election to adopt contentious laws that critics say undermine judicial oversight, benefit friendly media outlets, and aim to shore up support from ultra-Orthodox political allies. The new legislation could extend the wholesale exemptions from military service for ultra-Orthodox men enrolled in religious seminaries at a time when the military is chronically short of conscripts and reserve soldiers. With Mr. Netanyahu's coalition trailing in the polls, analysts said the new legislation appears aimed at cementing his alliances in case he gets another shot at forming a government, either this time or in a future round. Netanyahu is playing a long game by keeping all his coalition parties together, Rufin Hassan, a professor of political science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, said. He is making them realize he is the only one capable of giving them what they need. Mr. Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, has presided over one of the most fraught periods in the country's history. His latest term started with huge anti-government protests against the plan for a judicial overhaul aimed at limiting the authority of the Supreme Court and weakening legal oversight of the government, steps that critics call anti-democratic. The plan was temporarily suspended after the government and military were caught off guard by the deadly Hamas-led attack on southern Israel on October 7, 2023, which ignited a devastating 2-year war in Gaza. The conflicts spread to Lebanon and Iran. Mr. Netanyahu's promise of total victory was not fulfilled on any front, yet his government will be Israel's first since 1988 to run its full 4-year term, with the election set to take place on the last day allowed by law. Most governments have collapsed over disagreements, triggering early elections. This was the final week for the government to enact its controversial legislation. On Friday, the Knesset, Israel's parliament, goes into recess until after the national election scheduled for October 27th. Here are some of the most divisive pieces of legislation approved this week. Weakening the role of the Attorney General. Israel's Attorney General serves as both the chief legal advisor to the government and the head of public prosecution. The Attorney General is chosen by the government from among candidates approved by a panel of experts. Until now, the Attorney General's legal opinions have been binding on the government, acting as a crucial independent check on executive power. On Wednesday, Parliament passed a measure diluting the authority of the Attorney General's office, set to take effect in January 2027. Under the law, the government will no longer be required to treat the Attorney General's written legal opinions as legally binding, except in criminal matters. Mr. Netanyahu's government has been in constant conflict with the current Attorney General, Gali Baharav-Miara, who was appointed in 2022 under a previous government. Plans to weaken the office have been at the center of the current government's aspirations to curb judicial authority and give more power to elected politicians. Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet tried last year to fire her, but the Supreme Court blocked the move. The legislation also changes the rules for the government's legal representation in court, giving the government the authority to determine its own legal position. If the Attorney General declines to present that position or does not do so to the satisfaction of the relevant minister, the government may appoint alternative legal counsel, barring the Attorney General from presenting an independent position before the judges. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel described it as the most far-reaching step yet in the government's continued effort to weaken independent legal oversight. The association is one of the groups that has already petitioned the High Court to annul the new law. This move gives the government the power to decide for itself when and how to apply the law, Noah Satath, the executive director of the rights group, said in a statement. A special status for Torah students. Rather than a formal written constitution, Israel has a set of more than a dozen basic laws that govern its overall character and citizens' rights. On Monday, the Knesset passed a new basic law enshrining Torah study as a fundamental value in the heritage of the Jewish people and the State of Israel. Ultra-Orthodox politicians championed that basic law, the first pertaining to a specific sector of Israel's Jewish majority. They view it as a counterweight to Supreme Court rulings dictating that ultra-Orthodox men must do compulsory military service like other Jewish 18-year-olds in line with the principle of equality and believe it will strengthen their case against any forced enlistment. The law comes against the backdrop of widespread public resentment over the decades-old draft exemptions for the ultra-Orthodox as the military is stretched thin. Brigadier General Shea Tayeb of the military's Personnel Directorate told a Knesset committee this week that the Army's array of regular forces is reaching the limit of its capacity, and that of the reserve force may reach even beyond that. In some units, it may even collapse. Suspending penalties for draft evasion. The Knesset also passed an amendment that freezes for 4 months the arrests of ultra-Orthodox draft dodgers who received and ignored call-up notices issued in recent years, since the court ruled that the military must start conscripting them. The freeze applies to those enrolled in full-time study in religious seminaries, and will also extend to cover the summer break and the period of the Jewish high holy days in the fall. It comes out of recognition of the importance of Torah study, the amendment states. On Wednesday, just a day after the law was passed, Israel's High Court issued an order temporarily blocking it from taking effect, following petitions from opposition parties and government watchdog groups. The court is telling the government what we all knew. Deserting from the Israel Defense Forces during wartime is against the law, said Yair Lapid, the centrist leader of the opposition and one of the petitioners. Yet analysts say a fight with the court also benefits Mr. Netanyahu and his political allies. Mr. Hassan said it gives them fodder for their election campaign promise to curb the overreach of unelected judges. Underscoring what many Israelis see as the inequality inherent in these legislative moves, the Knesset is expected to approve another amendment later Thursday, extending compulsory service for those who are not exempted from 30 months to 32 months to try to address the personnel shortfall. Government influence over broadcast media. A media law that passed on Thursday is intended to remove regulatory barriers for small broadcasters and increase competition, according to the government. Critics say it will disadvantage the mainstream commercial television channels and benefit smaller, pro-Netanyahu outlets like Channel 14. The Union of Journalists in Israel issued a statement after the vote denouncing what it called a shameful, dangerous, and anti-democratic law. Mr. Netanyahu has long criticized the mainstream media in Israel, accusing it of left-wing elitism. He is currently on trial on corruption charges that include accusations that he traded regulatory favors for sympathetic media coverage of himself and his family. Has the World Cup turned me into a sports guy? The pleasures of watching the TV show of the summer as a bandwagon fan, by James Poniewozik. I'm not a sports guy. That is to say, I'm not a sports hater. I'll watch the occasional tennis final, an Olympic curling match, and the Michigan-Ohio State game in November, but I don't have the bandwidth to truly follow any sport. The athlete cameos and Super Bowl ads sail over my head. In my learned league trivia matches, the questions about Premier League soccer, there are more of them than you might think, always spell my doom. But the summer of 2026 has done strange things to the least sportsy among us. If you live in New York, as I do, you may have spent a lot of time rewatching the Knicks OG Anunoby reaching for that NBA Finals tip-in, like Michelangelo's God giving life to Adam, reminding us that we could actually have good things. Then the World Cup came ashore in North America, and lo, we had the show of the summer. The broadcasts are pulling American football ratings, setting records even in games not involving the U.S. team. This summer has felt as if the whole tense world were exhaling and taking a collective play break. I can resist sports, but I can't resist vibes. I started dipping into matches in the group stage. Also, I learned what a group stage is. I read up on Cape Verde and became willing to lay down my life for that country. Now I am that guy, glued to my phone in the passenger seat during a car ride, watching little red Norwegian dots try to maneuver around a swarm of tiny white English dots. Now I am setting calendar reminders for games between countries I will probably never visit. Now, am I a fan of sport? I do not mean to imply that I am suddenly sports knowledgeable. I supported Morocco because my mother was born and raised there. I know nothing more about the team than that, and I will not be taking further questions on the subject. I learned a smattering of terms from Ted Lasso. To invert the Supreme Court ruling on pornography, I know what offside is, but I don't know it when I see it. The broadcast industry is well aware of me and my fellow bandwagon jumpers. Will Ferrell even made a Lay's commercial for us, and it has taken measures to make our eyeballs comfortable. To the true fans out there, I apologize. People like me are, I assume, the reason for the numerous patronizing football, hockey, and basketball analogies made by the Fox Sports team to try to translate soccer for the Yanks. If it's any consolation, they don't help me understand the game any better. And these concessions seem unnecessary and dated, given the enormous growth in American soccer fandom. Even Hank Hill on the Hulu revival of King of the Hill loves soccer now. Many purists much prefer the announcing on Telemundo, which makes the radical assumption that its soccer audience likes the game. The actual play-by-play has kept my less than expert eye where it needs to be. The annoyances creep in at the edges. The hydration breaks that lubricate the ad sales machine, the enigmatic match momentum chart, the cringe-inducing pleas from the Fox booth for American fans not to bail after the U.S. team was eliminated by Belgium. And no amount of newfound fandom can make me enjoy the repurposed celebrity stunt comedy of James Corden on the Fox After Show, though as usual he seems to enjoy his own antics enough for everyone. The best entertainment lies in the fans, sporting goofy hats in the stands, discovering Costco and Buc-ee's in social media videos, proving that fun is a universal language. The sea of Norway fans doing their Viking row after a win, heaving and hoeing in unison to the rhythmic thump of a drum, is a special effect that House of the Dragon can't match. The play makes the cup, but the people make the world. I don't mean this in the naive sense that the World Cup brings all together and makes us forget our differences. Clearly it doesn't. It's a competition, often heightened by national rivalries and decades-old conflicts. There are wars across the globe, including the one between the United States and Iran, whose team was shunted across the border to Mexico between games. There was the presidential intervention into an American red card and homophobic chants by Mexican fans, and all these controversies were greeted gingerly, if at all, on the air. Still, this cup feels like the show we needed when we needed it. This is a time when countries on this continent and elsewhere are putting up barriers, coveting their neighbors' land, casting suspicions on outsiders, and guarding against perceived threats to their ethnic heritages. The low-stakes delights of this cup suggest that maybe it's actually good when people cross borders and mingle, bringing their cultures and silly customs to the party. Not everyone can afford the airfare and tickets, of course. The images I love most from the cup are the cutaways to the watch party crowds of ordinary fans around the world, thronging together, tensing up and exploding in cheers, transported by the same game that we're watching. We live in the age of the algorithmic feed, the personalized stream, the customized media experience. But occasionally, Marshall McLuhan's global village manages to reconstitute itself. There is still a power to these rare moments when live TV pulls us into a virtual stadium that exists everywhere at once, with a capacity of billions. That stadium will empty out soon. The cruel reality of an event like this for the bandwagoneer is that the more deeply you get into the games, the fewer games there are left. Am I going to need to figure out how to watch the Premier League? You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, July 17th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.